Beautiful, tender, handmade meatballs, swimming in rich, ultra creamy gravy, onion, garlic, herbs, spices. You know I'm talking about Swedish meatballs. When I was a kid back in the 1980s, if you would have come up to me and told me that in just a couple short decades, the only place you'd even be able to get a plate of Swedish meatballs would be a furniture warehouse, the first thing I'd say to you is probably, "Oh my God, who are you? Why are you in my house? Stranger danger!" The second thing I'd say is, what? "Oh yeah, I went to buy a $6 coffee table made out of particle board and sadness, so naturally I ate meatballs." Anyway, in today's episode of what I'm calling my unofficial venison series, if it hasn't become obvious by now, we're making Swedish meatballs. Swedish meatballs seem to be one of those things that was around a lot in the maybe 80s and 90s. We'd have it for dinner, you'd see it at restaurants. And now it really does seem like the only place I ever even hear about it is from Ikea. I don't really go to Ikea. In fact, I think the last time I was there might have been 10 years ago, and I did have some of their meatballs, but honestly, it was so long ago, I don't have any memory of them. But we're talking about making some handmade meatballs completely from scratch, and maybe you'd call these rustic meatballs because they're formed by hand, and they're not absolutely scientifically, mathematically spherical balls, but that's because they're made by hand with love and not in a 10-ton hydraulic press that forms them into, perfectly spherical little balls that can then be, frozen and shipped with the end tables and the sofas and whatnot to the individual stores. Anyway, enough of my Ikea rant. I don't really have anything against Ikea. I just don't really get the appeal. Nothing I've ever seen from Ikea. It seems like something I'd want, including the meatballs. I digress. We're not talking about that. We're talking about making our own venison meatballs from scratch. So let's jump right in and take a look at the piece of meat that we're going to be using. Since I'm only making a normal sized batch of meatballs, I only need 1 pound of meat. So I pulled this little cut of venison out of the freezer a couple days ago, and it's just over 1 pound. There is a little prep I have to do with this meat. This was one of the tough cuts that make up a deer hindquarter, and there's still a bit of fat and silver skin I have to trim off. This is a little tedious, and there's really no way around that, but with a sharp knife and some patience, I'll get it looking nice and ready for the grinder. Before grinding, I'll put the cubed up meat in the freezer for a little while to get it just a bit stiffened up. Then, using the medium-sized grind plate, I'll just run it all through the grinder. If you've been watching my videos lately, you've already seen this a bunch of times. Now, unfortunately, after I trimmed the fat and silver skin and such off of this cut, it no longer weighs a little more than a pound. It's now more like 3/4 of a pound. And rather than waiting 2 days to thaw out another cut, I'm just going to subsidize it with a little bit of ground sirloin I already have in the fridge. Now that I've got exactly 1 pound of my ground meat, it's time to start throwing in a bunch of other ingredients to make my classic Swedish meatball mixture. Minced yellow onion, minced garlic, fresh chopped parsley, some dry seasonings, allspice, nutmeg, garlic powder, onion powder, kosher salt, black pepper, and some plain breadcrumbs, and 1 egg. Now that we've got a big mess of ingredients in this big bowl, I'll just mix it all together. There's not really any better utensil for mixing small batches of meat than my own 10 fingers, so that's what I'll do. I don't need to work this meat to death, but I do want to make sure all those ingredients are fully incorporated and distributed throughout. When it's all mixed up, I'll cover the bowl with some plastic wrap and refrigerate for 30 minutes. This gives everything a chance to sort of firm up a bit before I start forming the meatballs. And now it's time to do just that. There isn't much of a secret technique to this step. I'll just grab a small hunk of that meat mixture and roll it and gently form it with my hands until I've got something resembling a ball. I'm aiming for the sort of classic Swedish meatball size here, which is not especially big. I do make some rather large Italian meatballs, but for these, I'm going pretty small. Each of these are probably about 1¼ inch in diameter. And just as I'd intended, / hoped, that batch of ingredients made exactly 20 of my little Swedish meatballs. Now we're moving over to the stove, and I'm going to get some oil heated up in my deep-walled cast iron skillet. Two things to mention. One, I'm going to use vegetable oil for this. I'm searing at sorta high heat, and a bunch of meatballs are going to be going in and out of this skillet, and my usual olive oil would surely start smoking quite a bit. Vegetable oil has a much higher smoke point, so I'm using that. And two, some people skip this step altogether and bake them in the oven instead. You can do it that way if you want, but giving it a good sear in a cast iron skillet is going to form a light crust on the meatball, seal in those juices better, and just altogether produce a better final product. So once my oil is good and hot, I'll start setting in some meatballs. I don't want to overcrowd the pan, so I'm going to do these in smaller batches. Those meatballs will release some moisture, and if I loaded them up all at once, I'd end up with a skillet full of meatballs stewing in their own juice. I want a sear, not a stew. Anyway, after a couple minutes, I'll turn the meatballs. And then after a couple more minutes, I'll turn them once more. Each meatball is realistically only going to get seared directly on 3 sides, but that's enough to brown the entire circumference nicely. And we're not trying to cook them all the way through here, just brown them up with a nice sear. Then I'll pull them out and sear my second batch of meatballs, and then my third, and that's it. I'll set all 20 meatballs aside for a short while we put together our amazing gravy. I'm going to use the same skillet for my gravy, but I'll give it a quick wipe first just to get any bigger seared bits of meatball out of there. But I'm not going to entirely clean the pan because there's a lot of flavor in there that I want in my sauce, which I'll start by dropping in a half stick of butter and letting it melt over medium heat. When it's all melted and looking beautiful, I'm sprinkling in some all-purpose flour and stirring it up into a nice roux. Let that cook for a solid minute or so, and then I'll start adding in my beef stock. I'll just do a little at a time, stir it in, then add a little more, and keep repeating until all my beef stock is in there. I'll let it cook for just a minute or two to get good and heated up, and then I'm going in with the heavy cream. Again, just a splash at a time until I've added it all. And as that all starts coming up to a simmer, I'll add the remaining ingredients. First, just a couple teaspoons of soy sauce. You could use Worcestershire for this if you prefer, but soy works very well. Then, just a little bit of Dijon mustard. Trust me, this tiny blob of mustard goes a long way, and any more than this would seriously overpower this batch of gravy. Lastly, some dry nutmeg. That nutmeg is acting a bit clumpy, so I'm switching to my whisk and giving it the business until everything is nice and smooth. Now with the sauce cooking at a very low simmer, I'm going to start carefully adding my meatballs back in. I'll make sure each one is covered in some gravy, and then I'm letting it all cook on low heat for about 15 minutes. Basically simmering those meatballs in the sauce until they're fully cooked the rest of the way through. Oh, and I nearly forgot my salt and pepper. So I'll sprinkle in a pinch of each and gently stir it in around those meatballs. At last, it's time to serve. Lay down a nice portion of those very pretty meatballs. And yes, that is a bit of parsley you're seeing on there. So maybe I already added some garnish to the pan so I could take my thumbnail photo. I'm certain you'll forgive me once you make this recipe and give it a taste. And of course we need to spoon over some more of that gravy. And now there isn't anything left to do except dig in and give it a taste. Man, that is a good meatball. And what's not to like? Fresh ground venison, onions, garlic, browned up in the skillet, smothered in that rich, creamy gravy. Get that little touch of the mustard, just a little bit. Those spices, particularly that nutmeg, shines through just a little bit. That gives it that sort of unique, trademark Swedish meatball flavor. And you saw me do every step. It's not really that hard to make. Just a little time consuming with making and forming all those little meatballs, browning them up. But really, the whole thing doesn't take all that long. And you get such a satisfying, comforting, wholesome, delicious final product. And I know that in addition to the Ikea meatballs, the sort of somewhat common format in which you might see Swedish meatballs would be in a slow cooker sitting on a table at a potluck, company Christmas party or something like that. And I've mentioned before that I'm not a huge slow cooker person. I know there's certain things that work quite well in it, but really, I don't know. You're stewing something all day long and it's just kind of wet and falling apart. and it pretty much applies to anything you put in there. So I can't speak to how well this exact recipe works as a slow cooker recipe. Obviously, you're not browning the outsides of the meatballs in a slow cooker, but maybe you can do that step in a skillet and then transfer everything over to a slow cooker with the gravy and everything. I really don't know. I personally don't know how that heavy cream-based sauce holds up sitting there all day over low or medium heat. But as for the skillet method that I did, it doesn't take a ton of time, and I think it's definitely something you could whip up for a weeknight dinner if maybe you've preformed the meatballs, say the day before, stuck them in the fridge. It's really the only kind of time-consuming part of the whole thing. Anyway, I hope you liked the video, and if you're looking to try a new venison recipe or a new meatball recipe, maybe give these Swedish meatballs a try. And of course, I'll have a link in the video description below to the full recipe, including everything that I used to make these meatballs and that gravy. Thanks for watching, and as I always say, be sure the food you're eating is made out of food. And until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.